Anyway, judging from the size of the crowd here, many of you must already know that EJ is really worth listening to. A number of you may have started following his writing years ago when he reported for the New York Times at home and abroad from the mid-1970s to the late 1980s. Some of you may have first noticed his byline only after he switched to the Washington Post in 1990 and then began composing columns in 1993. You may also have tuned into his frequent commentaries on NPR or MSNBC or read his work as a senior fellow at Brookings, which he joined 20 years ago, or enjoyed the dozen books or so that he's either written or co-edited. And if you're a friend, as I am, you may also be aware of EJ's tendency to tap his friends to come talk to his very popular class at Georgetown University, where he teaches at the Public Policy Institute. And you get a free lunch if you do that. So a lot of you may already be familiar with all of this about EJ, but what many of you may not know is something that he mentions in the introduction of his new book, Why the Right Went Wrong, and that is that he grew up as a conservative in a conservative family. So conservatism is not, as he says, quote, some exotic, irrational creed to him, even if his own views shifted many years ago toward the center left. Today he describes himself as a, quote, unapologetic liberal of social democratic inclinations and a temperate disposition.
Everyone agrees with that except my wife.
Everybody, he says, agrees except his wife, Mary. But he continues to respect the conservative tradition and believes that it's a vital component of a balanced, vibrant democratic order, which is the frame of mind in which he approached the extensive critique he offers of what has happened to the Republican Party and the American conservative movement over the past half century. His critique arises not from any hostility to the tradition of conservatism or from a lack of appreciation for its importance. Rather, it reflects the deep disappointment he feels about what's gone awry. Typical of much of his work, EJ put quite a bit of research into this new book. He seems to have interviewed and bounced ideas off of just about every Republican politician, thinker, strategist, and writer that he could find. And you just look at the acknowledgments. EJ is famous for long acknowledgments in his books. And while he says he did try to contain himself this time around, he still has ended up listing quite a few Republicans who spent time discussing with him the struggles of the American right. The result is a very insightful and lucid account. The LA Times called it relentlessly analytical, and clearly it's a very timely critique of conservatism from Goldwater in the 1960s to the Tea Party and Trump of the present day. It's a story that, as EJ argues, has left a trail of broken promises and led to an ever more reactionary brand of radicalism with little room for moderate Republicans. So, ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming EJ Dionne.
As you could tell from that, Brad is one of the people I have had come into my class at Georgetown. And if you haven't read them, Brad has written some extraordinary books on national defense. Years ago, a friend described me as the only person he ever met who'd go 2,000 miles out of his way just to impose. And I do impose on my friends on behalf of my students, so I'm grateful to Brad. I have so many old friends here that I cannot acknowledge you all, but there are two people besides Brad and Lisa, and I want to say a word about them that I want to acknowledge. One is my wife, Mary, who, if she found parking, is in here somewhere. There you are. I love you, Mary. She, by the way, is acknowledged on page 475. My acknowledgments are so long that I was actually once attacked in The Economist in a piece under the headline, Gratitude That Grates. But I'm a very lucky sort of guy, and I have a lot of people to be grateful to, so I end up writing long acknowledgments. The other person who is so critical to this book is my assistant, Elizabeth Tom. Elizabeth, where are you? You're here somewhere. Are you way back there? Anyway, God bless you. She's acknowledged on page 473 of the book. And thank you for coming, Elizabeth. Brad and Lissa, there are so many. Oh, and my agent, Gail Ross, came today. God bless you, Gail. Thank you so much for coming, who was truly instrumental in this book's existence in many different ways. And I am so grateful to you, Gail. So thank you very much. I'm glad you stood in the front. I'm sorry? What page? I didn't know you were here. I'll look it up. Somewhere in the 470s. They're not that long. So thank you. But Brad and Lissa, there are so many of us who loved and still love, even though they're not here anymore, Carla Cohen and David Cohen. And let's hear it for them. They are such extraordinary people, and they're partners on this bookstore. And I think when the owners decided to sell, they weren't just looking for money; they were looking for stewards. And the tradition of this bookstore is as a community resource, as a form of continuing education, and as a place for discussion and argument. And Brad and Lissa have really kept this going, and they've done it by preserving the best of the old tradition, but by doing new things to keep the store lively and in business. And to me, they represent actually the best kind of conservatism, which is about preserving that which should be preserved, but a willingness to change in order to preserve the best values. I throw Edmund Burke a lot at conservatives in this book. Now, the truth is liberals have been throwing Edmund Burke at conservatives since the rise of the radical right in the 50s without much effect. But I'm hoping maybe this time it'll take. But Edmund Burke said that a statesman must combine a disposition to preserve and an ability to improve. And that's exactly what Brad and Lissa have done with this bookstore. So God bless them for that. I also wanted to thank, and indie bookstores, by the way, are making a big comeback around the country, which is good news for book lovers and communities. Two things I always say at the beginning of talks. One, after somebody has given me a nice introduction like that, I recall the one I once got in the Midwest that ended, and now for the latest dope from Washington, here's E.J. Dionne. And the other thing I like to do is to talk about an email I just got. We columnists are seen as an arrogant lot. Indeed, a lot of us seem to work at it. But in fact, we are kept humble by our readers. Ever look at the comments under a column? And also, you get comments in many different ways, and that's useful. I don't object if I have the luck to be able to voice my opinions on the world. People can throw theirs right back at me, and that's up to them. My favorite email along these lines began, "Dear Mr. Dionne," which was already a big advance on a lot of the email I get. And the next line was, "Are you as dumb in person?" And the reason I like to begin every talk with that story is you may get nothing out of this talk, but at least you'll be able to answer that question for yourself. So thank you for coming. I should express my deepest gratitude to the Republican Party and to Donald Trump, because no one who wrote a book called Why the Right Went Wrong could be better served by a Republican primary campaign than this one. I mean, if you saw the debate this week, they themselves described this choice as a con artist versus a choke artist versus a liar. That's their own sort of self-description. And the other people who owe Trump in particular an enormous debt are comedians. And I've sort of as this book, I've been sort of promoting this book, I've started making a collection of some of my favorite Trump commentary. I did like the one that said he is the kind of person who goes to the Super Bowl and thinks the people in the huddle are talking about him. My Washington Post colleague, Carlos Lozada, by the way, if you haven't read it yet, there's a wonderful piece by Carlos in the Outlook section that looks at Hillary Clinton's It Takes a Village book, which is being published on the 20th anniversary. I guess I can sell another book for Politics and Prose tonight, and really argues that that may be the closest we get to what Hillary Clinton's philosophy is. Anyway, it's a wonderful piece. But Carlos, after Trump picked a fight with the Pope, after the Pope said some critical things about him, reflected on Twitter of, well, where would Trump go next? And this is what Carlos tweeted. Why did it take him 3 days to rise? I would have risen in 3 hours. Jesus, very low energy. Someone else operating along those lines said, this is truly one of the worst. Pope drives a Fiat, which is a very weak car, low energy, can barely hit 80. I drive a Cadillac. Nice. And then lastly in this theme, I did love Conan O'Brien's discussion of a poll. He said, the poll showed that nearly 70% of Americans said a Trump presidency would make them anxious, and the other 30% said it would make them Canadian. So I owe a deep debt to the man, I got to confess, even though God help the Republic if he becomes president. So what do I'm going to talk for a little bit about the book. I don't want to give away too much because I would like you to buy it. And if you need an incentive, we have 5 more years of college tuitions to pay. So if you pay money for this book, you will be helping to send our kids to college, which Mary and I will be grateful for. But I just want to talk a bit about the book and then open it up to Q&A and conversation about this amazing year and what's happened to the Republican Party. And the conservative movement. I will also, by the way, happily talk about my conversion at age 13 to being a liberal. That's when I started, and I owe a great debt to my dad, actually, because he, rather than discourage me, he loved political arguments, so he even encouraged me to argue with him. He gave me, at my request, a subscription to the New Republic when I was 13 to strengthen my side of our debates. So he and my mom taught me what I ended up doing for a living for the rest of my life. So I'm very grateful to them. But the first sentence of Why the Right Went Wrong is the history of contemporary American conservatism is a story of disappointment and betrayal. And the book argues that since the time of Goldwater, conservative politicians have had to make a series of promises they couldn't possibly keep. In shorthand, they promised to reduce the size of government back to where it might have been around the 1890s, to roll the culture back to where it was around the 1950s, and lately to change the ethnic makeup of the country back to where it was in the 1940s. And this was not possible. In particular, the promise to reduce the size of government was a hopeless promise from the beginning. Neither Nixon, since Goldwater, neither Nixon nor Reagan nor either President Bush could do it. Government as a share of GDP was exactly the same size was when Ronald Reagan left office as when he took office. Now, why is that? Well, turns out Americans rather like government in the concrete, even when they dislike it in the abstract. Two great analysts of public opinion, Lloyd Free and Hadley Cantrell, wrote many, many years ago that Americans are ideological, conservative, and operational liberals. And that's just a way of saying they complain and complain and complain about government, but then they want it to do a bunch of stuff. Probably the clearest case of the problem conservatives have is large numbers of Tea Party members are absolutely opposed to cuts in Medicare or Social Security. Now, they make an argument, and I sort of get into this in the book, that those are earned benefits, unlike the other government benefits that go to freeloaders. But it's probably just an accident that a disproportionate number of Tea Partiers are near, at, or over the age of 65. And they just, and you go through the entire list of government programs. What got regulation? Oh, that's a terrible thing, except when it keeps your air and water clean or protects you from unsafe products. Or keeps us, if it had been done right, from having a complete financial collapse. My favorite line on this, which I've quoted for years and couldn't resist putting in the book again, is from Senator Bill Cohen, the former liberal Republican senator from Maine, who later was in Secretary of Defense under President Clinton. And after the value jet crash way back in the 90s, when everybody was complaining, where was the FAA and so on, and Bill Cohen said, government is the enemy until you need a friend. And that's very true. Similarly, we don't want to roll back all the cultural change. Yes, there's been racial backlash for years and years and years. But the truth is, we don't want to go back as a country. A vast majority of Americans do not want to go back to the pre-civil rights years. We don't want to go back on the idea that men and women are equal. And as the rapid change in opinion in the country shows, we don't want to go back on gay and lesbian rights either. Too many Americans have discovered that someone they love, care about, work with is gay or lesbian to sort of hold views they might have held before large numbers of gays and lesbians came out of the closet, which parenthetically is one of the single most successful political acts that any group ever engaged in. Now, the conservative base looks at the politicians they elect and they say, we keep voting for you guys. You keep saying that you're going to make these changes. And then suddenly, somehow, this never really happens. And happily for me, as I was finishing the book, there was a wonderful interview with by Molly Ball of The Atlantic with Eric Erickson, the editor of the right-wing blog Red State, and he said I had written this whole book with this thesis, and along comes Eric Erickson saying the Republican Party created Donald Trump because they made a series of promises to their base and never kept them. And that's where this comes from. It comes from somewhere else as well, and this is another central theme of the book. Which is that the Republican Party and conservative politicians have been getting votes from white working class voters for decades and decades and haven't done anything for them. And this isn't just some liberal with a social democratic leaning saying that. A lot of conservatives, particularly Ross Douthat, the columnist for the New York Times, many of you read, or Reihan Salam, conservative intellectual. Ross and Reihan some years ago wrote a piece called The Party of Sam's Club, a phrase invented by former Governor Tim Pawlenty. And they directly said, we are getting these votes from all these people, and we're not doing anything for them. And lo and behold, along comes Donald Trump, who in a way is the revenge of the Republican working class. I mean, it may be odd for a billionaire builder if he actually is a billionaire. I love the theory that the reason he doesn't want to release his tax returns is he's not as rich as he says he is, which is unusual in politics. Usually all politicians poor-mouth themselves. I was born in a log cabin that I built by myself kind of thing. That's an old Bill Clinton line. But Trump really is leading a class war in the Republican Party. And while he's getting support across the board ideologically, his strongest support comes from less well-off Republicans and Republicans with lower levels of formal education. You may have noticed last week one of the most remarkable lines in American politics, Donald Trump saying, "I love the poorly educated." So, which I guess means he might cut education funding. I mean, it could be. It's troubling. But in fairness to the poorly educated, in fact, they are the people being most hammered in this economy. They have been battered brutally by economic change, by globalization, by technological change. And if there is one good thing that could come out of this Trump rebellion, and some of this applies also to Bernie Sanders's insurgency, it is that elites start paying more attention to what is happening to millions and millions of working class people in our country. I think one of the most disturbing studies to come out in recent years was a study that showed the increased suicide rate among older white men in the country. And older and it was disproportionately among lower income white men. So we have on the one side some really powerful leftover problems that African Americans face in their communities, and we've finally come to greater awareness of it because of police cameras and the recent shootings of innocents. And I was talking to a politician in the Midwest recently who said that when you look at the Black Lives Matter movement, the folks who are active in it are not just motivated by their concern for what's happening to young, mostly men in their communities. They're also very worried and angry about their own economic opportunities. So this is jumping ahead of my story. Maybe the next book is called Where the Left Should Go. But I do think that the concerns of the white working class and the concerns of African Americans actually overlap more than our politics lets us realize, and certainly a lot more than Donald Trump's campaign would want you to believe. So let me just make a couple other quick points off the book to give you a sort of a sense of what the book is. It is largely a historical book. I have this habit, it may be a bad habit, that everything I touch seems to turn to history because when I sort of start saying, well, this happened because this happened, and I keep wanting to go back. And I could have gone all the way back to the 30s, but I decided that really where it started was in the takeover of the Republican Party in 1964 by conservatives. That the Goldwater movement, I think, will turn out on long retrospect to be one of the most important political events in our country's history. Now, a lot of people have fond memories of Goldwater, and I certainly have a lot of respect for him. He was a decent man. He had a good sense of humor. He was a candid man. Later in life, he developed real doubts about the direction his own movement was taking. He didn't much like the religious right. It was he who told Richard Nixon that it was time to go, and once Nixon lost Goldwater, he knew it was time to go. But in 1964, he was a really hard ideologue, and it's worth looking back to his book, The Conscience of a Conservative, written in 1960, ghostwritten actually by Brent Mazzell, Bill Buckley's brother-in-law. And if you cut out the part about the Soviet Union, which is dated, it could be republished with a different name on the cover as a Tea Party book, because it really was all about cutting the size of government. And Goldwater, who was no racist, opposed the Civil Rights Act because he felt it impinged on property rights and on states' rights, which effectively aligned a man who had supported local civil rights laws back in Arizona with Southern segregationists. It's something we could deal with in the Q&A. I talk a lot about race in the book because I think racial reaction going back to the 30s was central to the formation of the current conservative coalition. And you really began to see the old New Deal coalition begin to fall apart as early as the late 1930s. But it came to full fruition in 1964, and 64 marked, among other things, the Southernization of the Republican Party. Imagine that, the Southernization of the party of Lincoln. And if you look, by the way, at the results of the 2008 election, all of the Lincoln states voted for Barack Obama. Even Indiana, which was historically a Republican state, switched over to Obama. And it's very striking how sharply the numbers shifted from north to south as to what kind of party this is. Just an example. If you look at Republicans elected to the House in 1960 and in 2008, roughly equal numbers, 174 in 1960, 178 in 2008. But in 1960, 35 of those Republicans represented districts in New York and New England alone, 35. Only 8 hailed from the states of the old Confederacy. Jump ahead to 2008, only 3 came from New York and New England, and 73 represented the states of the old Confederacy. Now, this shift right in the Republican Party and this shift south had a couple of effects. One is that first liberal and then moderate Republicans were purged out of the party. And we forget how many liberal Republicans there were. People like Jacob Javits in New York, Clifford Case of New Jersey, whom National Review used to refer to as Hopeless Case, or Tom Kuchel in California, They all lost in primaries, and then moderates started falling in primaries. But something else happened. The moderates also started losing because a lot of moderate to liberal Republicans were actually elected by Democrats who liked them, thought it was good to have some moderate to progressive voices in the Republican Party, and then their voters turned on them because even though they continued to like the politician, they didn't want to empower this new conservative majority. Probably the example we all know best in this area is Connie Morella out in Montgomery County. A little artful gerrymandering hurt her. But if you looked at her vote over many years, when the Gingrich forces took over the party, her vote went down steadily. And I suspect on Election Day, if you had asked a poll to the people who voted her out, the vast majority liked her. But it was what had happened to the Republican Party. This is a problem the party faces right now. Searching around for voters who will vote against Trump and Cruz, the so-called Republican establishment. I kind of don't believe in a Republican establishment because I think there are now several establishments. I also think the Republican establishment has moved substantially to the right. Two very smart conservative writers, Rich Lowry and Ramesh Ponnuru, wrote a wonderful piece in 2014 called Establishment Tea. And as Republicans, they were celebrating the fact that the establishment had come together. But what they were really saying is a lot of the establishment had gone over to Tea Party views to kind of hang on to their power. And if you look at Marco Rubio, the great hope of the establishment, he is no liberal. He is no moderate. He is very, very conservative. But even to find votes for people like Rubio or somebody who is at least tonally far more moderate, John Kasich, those voters aren't there anymore. Again, go across the New England, the Northeast, the Midwest, and the West Coast, areas that had been historically Republican, kind of George H.W. Bush Republican or Dwight Eisenhower Republican, starting in the 1990s, shifted either to becoming purple or blue. The collar counties around Philadelphia, good example. Lake County in Illinois. On this book tour, I met a Republican precinct captain in DuPage County, Illinois, which is a really solid Republican base, kind of almost machine Republicans. And he said he's running into a lot of trouble because every door he knocks on, if he gets the guy in the house, the woman is almost always going to vote against the Republican Party. And that speaks to the fact that college-educated women are an important group the party has lost over a long period of time. And women are, in general, a moderating force in politics. They are less likely than men to vote for extreme candidates. When you start losing them in your party, you have a real problem, as the Republicans do. So I talk a lot in the book about Reagan, and I talk about him as an ambiguous hero for conservatives, and I'll be happy in the Q&A to talk more about Reagan. But in my interviews, one of my favorite observations came from Charles Krauthammer, who said about Reagan, "You can choose your Reagan." And he is absolutely right about that. There is the Reagan who was the movement builder, who really was a hard ideologue, and there was the Reagan who governed, who was fortunate, actually, to have to govern with Democrats in California and with Tip O'Neill in Washington, and he was willing to be pragmatic when necessary. It's really striking when you look back at the Reagan foreign policy. He actually committed us to one war, and that was with Grenada, which had 110 people in their army. And in fact, when he sent the troops to Lebanon, I spent time in Lebanon as a reporter. It was a terrible mistake, and it led to the blowing up of the deaths of 241 young Americans. He pulled the troops right out. Now, you can imagine the words cut and run being used if Reagan had not been a Republican, although I do think it was about time those Marines get pulled out. It was too late, but it was time to pull them out. So Reagan is an ambiguous figure. Nixon, Nixon, we will always have a debt to. Anybody who likes political history will have a debt to Richard Nixon, probably one of the most complicated people in our history. In some ways, he's one of the most liberal presidents we ever had. When you look at his creating the EPA, his creating OSHA, he basically conceded an awful lot of domestic policy to the Democratic Congress because he mostly cared about foreign policy. Yet he was also one of the most right-wing presidents in the sense that it was he who really made the Southern strategy work, who was hardline on crime, And he did both of these things. One of the most fruitful interviews I had actually was with Pat Buchanan, who talked about the ambiguities right inside the Nixon operation. You know which side of those fights Pat was on. And I go through historically to Clinton, and I argue that the impeachment happened in part because it was in the 90s where the polarization of our politics really began, where the Republican Party really became a much more purely conservative party, and it was an illogical, logical outcome, if you will, of what was going on at the time. And then we have the obstructionism under President Obama. And the only point I want to make about that, again, it's something we could talk about, we will be talking about for decades, is, a lot of people say that President Obama could have done more to schmooze Congress. And I kind of think he could have done more to schmooze Congress. Democrats would like to get schmoozed more than they did. One of my favorite quotes in the book is from Nancy Pelosi, who, when the president seemed to leave the Democrats out to hanging out there when the stimulus fight happened. Nancy Pelosi, who has been one of the president's strongest supporters, said, "Mr. President, I don't mind if you throw us under the bus. I just object when you back the bus up and run us over again." But he could have been a schmoozer at Bill Clinton's level, and I don't think it would have made any difference. And what I report in the book is on the very day he was inaugurated, giving this great speech, it could have been a very partisan inaugural. It might have been more effective if it had been a partisan inaugural. It was a unifying inaugural. There were a group of Republicans, including now Speaker Ryan and Kevin McCarthy and Eric Cantor, and it was organized by Frank Luntz, where at the end of the dinner, they agreed basically we have to oppose the president's program, right from the start. And sure enough, not a single House Republican voted for the stimulus. A month later, Mitch McConnell had a similar meeting with Senate Republicans and very shrewdly laid out how they would gradually raise the temperature of their opposition to President Obama. So I want to close with 2 points. One is, there is a hero in my book, and I hope all of you Stevenson Democrats will forgive me for this, and that's Dwight Eisenhower. And the reason Eisenhower is a hero is that he was really the alternative form of conservatism that was available when Barry Goldwater's movement came along. And Ike and his kind of Republicans were even more the enemies of the conservative movement than the liberal Democrats were. The liberal Democrats were at least in the right party. They thought the Ike people had taken over and betrayed Republican principles. The seam of betrayal goes way back on the right. And I insist, by the way, that Ike was not a moderate, but was a genuine conservative, but a conservative of a Burkean sort. He was a budget balancer. He was pro-business. He was sympathetic to religion in public life. But like a Burkean conservative, he accepted that certain changes become part of the fabric of American life. So he didn't want to throw out the entire New Deal, which he thought would be politically foolish and impossible anyway, but he didn't believe in doing it. And he also saw a useful role for government. If one of the things you might enjoy reading online is Ike's farewell address. We remember it for his warnings about the military-industrial complex, but the whole thing is really a description of what a different kind of conservatism looks like. And the statement is shot through with the words prudence and balance. And to me, that is the kind of conservatism we need. The other kind of thing we need from conservatives is a little more hopefulness about the country as it is. I think one of the hardest things about watching these Republican debates is how utterly gloomy the Republicans are, and this brand of conservative is, about the United States that's come into being. It's as if everything we've done are wrong turns. And yes, as I said at the beginning, there were real problems out there that we have to solve, and I think they particularly are problems on the one side of the white working class and on the other side of what's going on in our urban African-American communities. But we are actually in better shape as a country than almost anybody in the world. If you look at the way we dealt with the economic meltdown, yes, Keynes came in handy, both on the Obama side and on the Fed side. We came out of the downturn better than almost any other economy in the world. And I think we are better for the changes we have made over the last 60 years. My favorite line, I think I've used it in this bookstore before, on America, is Churchill's line that Americans always do the right thing after first exhausting all of the other possibilities. And I like that because that speaks to our capacity for self-correction. The Selma speech that President Obama gave is one of the best speeches of his presidency, I think, because it really it didn't celebrate America because we do everything the same as our founders did. It celebrates America because our founders set us on a journey through which we continuously corrected the things that were wrong with our country and moved to a higher level. So I want conservatives to be a little more optimistic. They are right to revere those who came before us, but they will not prosper if they continue to yearn for a past they will never be able to call back to life. If I can close by quoting Eisenhower, Ike said in 1952, "Neither a wise man nor a brave man lies down on the tracks of history to wait for the train of the future to run over him." Conservatives need a bit more of what Sarah Palin called the hopey-changey thing. And while a liberal might not persuade them to do this, I am hoping their political circumstances will. Thank you all very much for coming. Hello to my old next-door neighbors, by the way. It's great to see you.
Hello.
Thank you. Let me just ask, not on my behalf, but on behalf of other people, I could probably argue and talk and agree with people all night long. If you could keep your questions short, just because I want to include, or comments, you can dissent, but keep them short so we can include more people. I'd be very grateful. Please.
Well, thank you for your work. And in light of your historical knowledge, I wanted you to comment on the Supreme Court justice and whether or not you believe President Obama will prevail in nominating, not just nominating, but securing a new justice on the Supreme Court in light of the conservative view.
Thank you very much. I am not optimistic. I wish I could be optimistic about this. But I do think it's very important to realize that, if we are honest, we liberals, we wouldn't want a really right-wing judge to be the swing vote again. But it seems to me they have gone way farther than even liberals who would oppose and fight against conservative judges. I mean, I, for one, was against Justice Roberts. I thought he was more conservative than he looked. I thought it was actually a form of prejudice on the part of liberals. Just because Roberts was a nice guy and really smart, they figured he couldn't really be a conservative. But he actually, I know a lot of nice, smart conservatives, But they, liberals didn't say right from the get-go. I mean, Justice Scalia had barely died when, the president shouldn't nominate anybody. We're not going to deal with somebody if they do. If he does not have hearings, they have a bunch of them, as far as I can tell, still haven't agreed to come in and talk to the president about, who might be acceptable to you. Now, because of that, I think there is a potential to make this at least an election issue in a way the court hasn't been before. In other words, everybody says the court's really important, but the people who tend to vote for on it are elites and social conservatives who are still very angry about Roe v. Wade. What we've seen in the last 10 years is, and more than that in some ways, is the rise of a conservative judicial activism that has broken precedent to by 5-4 institute the Citizens United decision, which tore down barriers to money in politics that have been standing in some cases for 100 years. The gutting of the Voting Rights Act, the blocking the president's climate change plan. It seems to me that there are now a whole lot of progressive constituencies who are invested in the court. And then the last quick point, and somebody suggested this to me when I was in the Midwest this week, that was fiendishly clever. This person said, they'll get Obama to nominate a moderate, and then if they lose the Senate and the presidency, they'll confirm the moderate before Hillary Clinton takes office. So that is one way in which he might get it. But thank you very much, ma'am. I appreciate it. Sir.
Given the state of the Republican Party today, is the United States still governable? Some background. My father was born in Imperial Russia in 1905. After World War I, he became part of Poland. And he told me that in the 18th century, the Polish parliament, which consisted of aristocrats, just one person, you needed unanimous consent to have anything done. So what the great powers of the day, Russia, Prussia, and Austria would do, all they had to do was buy one nobleman, and they could veto any law that they objected to. The result, of course, was Poland was partitioned among Prussia, Russia, and Austria. I wonder, are we heading in that direction?
One of the reasons, thank you very much for that question and comment. One of the reasons I wrote the book is the subtitle of the introduction is Why Reforming the Country Requires Transforming the Right. One of the reasons I wrote this book is because I do not believe we can govern ourselves successfully if the right stays in the place that it's in now. Now, if we lived in a country with a proportional representation system, having a party of the right of this sort would not be a problem, because in order to form a coalition government, they'd have to make accommodations with others. But we live in a system of separated powers and divided government. And the result is what you've seen in the Obama presidency since the Democrats lost the House in 2010, which is no willingness to compromise. And like my friends Tom Mann and Norm Ornstein, who many of you here know, I think it's very important to recognize that the polarization in the country is asymmetric. That is to say, the Republicans and the conservatives have moved farther right than the Democrats have moved left. 2014 Pew survey, 67% of Republicans call themselves conservative. Only 34% of Democrats call themselves liberal. A lot more moderates or non-liberals in the Democratic Party. Now, my hunch is that liberals are gaining ground because of young people. But even if that number is 40 or even 50%, it still doesn't approach where the Republicans are. The other poll question I think is really revealing is Pew asked, do you prefer politicians who make compromises with people they disagree with or those who stick to their principles? 59% of Democrats, but only 36% of Republicans said they preferred compromisers. So I think you need a more moderate right to govern ourselves in a system of separated powers. And yes, I am, I suppose, asking my conservative friends to make some concessions, except I would argue they're not really making concessions of principle because they can't really live by the principles they are actually espousing. And so they might as well come back to a more reasonable position. Quick example, climate change. You didn't used to have to deny climate change in the Republican Party. John McCain introduced a bill with Joe Lieberman that we would, people who care about climate change would be glad to pass. There was a big argument to be had. The more conservative approach might lean more on carbon taxes. A more, progressive approach might be something more like cap and trade. But we could argue about this, but let's agree to solve the problem. And I can think of a whole bunch of things on a list where you could have more liberal or more, progressive or more conservative approaches, but at least recognize the government did have a role to solve that problem. So, yes, I wrote the book in part because I'm very worried about the very question you are asking. And you'll be pleased to know you're the second person who taught me about the Polish problem in the course of my doing this. Thank you very much. Sir?
Yes. Could you comment on the population shift from the north to the south and how it would delay the demise of the current right-wing thinking in the Republican Party? That the right-wing thinking would go away much sooner if not for the population shift.
I think that's a great question. I think they've gained all they can out of the population shift. I now think it's actually working the other way. Okay. Why is Virginia now a purple state or even almost a Democratic state? It's because of all the folks who moved into Fairfax, Arlington, and that whole area of Virginia. Why is Florida no longer a solidly Republican state. Well, heck, that state is part New York, part Brooklyn, part Ohio. I mean, that state is everybody. The same thing is happening in North Carolina, which is why President Obama carried it once. I think it will happen eventually in Georgia, and it's happening in Texas. So actually, I think the paradox of the population shift is it built the Republicans and the conservative movement, but now it may start taking away some of their power. It'll take some time, but already, in Virginia, North Carolina, and Florida, we've seen the impact of that, because not everybody who moves south suddenly becomes Southern in their attitudes, Sir?
Hey, AJ. I'm glad you brought this up earlier. I wanted to follow up on the point about Republicans kind of coming back toward the middle. Practically speaking, what would it take? What kind of incentive do they have to come back? Because currently, with the way the primary systems are, I think a lot of them, fear primary challenges if they're not, conservative enough. So what do you see as bringing them back?
As I was writing this book, thank you, I talk about this problem, and I was, at one point I feared I'll need a deus ex machina, because if you look at some of the structural problems with moderating the Republican Party, I mean, right at the heart of my argument is so many of the moderate voters have left. I've sometimes thought that half the liberals of the country should re-register Republican just to save the Republican Party and pull them back to a more reasonable place. But I think there are a couple of things. One is, in the book, I identify sort of two kinds of Republicans who are beginning to say, we can't go on like this. One kind are very practical political operatives. One of the best examples is Jim Brulte, who is the Republican state chair in California. And as you all know, California used to be a very Republican state, Ronald Reagan state. And then Governor Pete Wilson introduced Prop 187, alienated Latinos, now going on for a generation or more. And that state is now one of the most democratic states in the union. And Brulte said to me that he wants to hold up California as an example of what happens if the Republicans do not begin to change. I'm trying to find a wonderful quote that I have from him. But while I'm doing that, there are also, I think, conservative intellectuals who don't go nearly as far as I think they should. And they have told me that they're they appreciate the fact that I pay attention to them, but they think I won't be satisfied with them until they become social democrats. And, I would kind of like that. I'd like them all to convert. But in fact, I think the sort of intellectuals in the party, the reform conservatives, some of the old compassionate conservatives themselves have been too constrained in how much they're willing to challenge conservative ideology. But at least they acknowledge that something is wrong. And my hunch is it may take, I won't find that Brulte quote, but it may take, another defeat. There is a kind of rule of three, another defeat in presidential elections. There is a kind of rule of three. Democrats lost 3 elections in the 80s and figured out they needed to adjust some to win. The British conservatives lost 3 elections, and then they embraced the moderation and modernization of David Cameron. Now, I'm not a Tory. I'd vote the other way, but that we wouldn't mind that kind of conservatism in the United States compared to what we got right now. So I think there are forces. And then the last thing is the future's not on their side, and the smart ones know it. The younger generation is the most liberal generation in the country, also the most diverse generation in the country. They've kind of replaced the old New Deal generation that passed on as the sort of heart of liberals. Now, that presents a problem for liberals because younger voters are less likely to turn out, particularly in midterm elections. And that's why the Republicans have done so well in these midterms. But their very success in the midterms underscores how dependent they are on older white voters in an increasingly diverse country where young people don't have a lot of time for their arguments. Now, you look at me, I don't have anything against older white voters, but they're not the people you want to hang your whole future on because it's not going to work. So I think there are forces within, and I think some electoral outcomes will eventually push them down that path. Thank you.
This is a what-if question. What if Donald Trump got the nomination and somehow won the presidency? Could you speculate about his ability to compromise or to lead the government?
the compromise is very weak. No, I think the fascinating thing, honestly, the politician I think Trump most resembles is Marianne Le Pen in France, the leader of the National Front. And one of the reasons why people have such a hard time getting a handle on Trump is that he's very right-wing in certain respects, on immigration, on keeping Muslims out of the country often, and some of his comments on race and law and order. And yet he is quite populist and nationalist in talking about the economy. His attack on the trade agreements, for example. He has called for the government negotiating drug prices under Medicare. That's a core Democratic idea. He said he won't cut Social Security or Medicare. I mean, he's been more critical of Bush, George W. Bush, and Iraq than he's used language that Democrats were afraid to use. So there is this really interesting mix of a certain kind of nationalism with unusual positions. I think the real truth is I don't think we have any idea what Donald Trump really believes. I think that's true. I mean, he has occupied a lot of places on the political spectrum over the years. So, on the one hand, yes, he could be a compromiser and actually work pretty well with all the Democrats he gave money to over the years. But there's another side of him that seems deeply and alarmingly authoritarian, and that and is really troubling, especially I think if you're a person of color. But I think to all of us, in some of the ways he talks, I don't know. I don't think we know which way this turns out. And just to answer a question that wasn't asked, I still don't think we're going to make Trump our president if he gets the nomination, because I think too many suburban swing voters are going to say, assuming it is Hillary Clinton, and she certainly seems favored now. I see a Clinton button there. I think a lot of those swing voters, whether they're crazy about Hillary or not, will say she's a lot safer than Donald Trump. She almost becomes the small c conservative candidate against Donald Trump in that sense. But I think the danger to Democrats is he cuts into the Democratic vote in states like Pennsylvania, Ohio, Michigan with his economic nationalism. And that, I think, will be the drama of that election. But the answer really is I don't think we can know how this guy would govern. Please.
Yeah, hi, EJ.
Yeah. Wait, may I just tell people who you are? This is how books get written. John Hauge is an old friend of mine. I was trying to catch a cab, and I couldn't, again, imposing on your friends. So Hauge sort of pulls over the side and says, "Where are you going?" And I was actually going to do an interview on Capitol Hill. And so John, the kind person he has been his whole life, gives me a ride. But not only that, I talked to him about the book, and I explained my love of Eisenhower, and he said, his dad worked for Dwight Eisenhower. His dad was a very well-known man called Gabriel Hauge, who later became a prominent person in banking in New York. And he said, I've been going through my dad's papers. And when I was doing the final changes on the book, I told my production editor, we must get this quote from Gabriel Hauge into the book. And so in a 1955 speech, Gabriel Hauge, an assistant to Eisenhower, later became a leading New York bank executive, defined the economics of Eisenhower conservatism. Ike said, stressed free markets and private initiative in the tradition of incentive and reward, but he also recognized that programs from the New Deal era met real needs and had thus been integrated into the American way. Eisenhower conservatism, Hauge said, was neither standpatism nor reaction and did not seek to stop the clock of progress or turn it back. So may we have a moment of memory for John's dad. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
That reminds me of the House of Commons windbag who stood up and thought better of it and sat down, and they say he rose without a friend and sat down without an enemy.
No, go ahead, John. Now, of course, having said all that, he's going to say, you misquoted my dad. No.
No, you'd indicated you thought politicians couldn't keep their promises, and I'd like to wonder if the flip side is equally true, that people don't really expect those promises to be kept. There's a book about Washington, Let Them Eat Promises. And this is because of the presidential congressional dynamic and the political careerism. Because if you really believed that, then people would read the platforms at the conventions, they'd actually go out and vote, and they'd hold our current candidates, for example, accountable for some of their budgets. But my guess is they just want to see directionally that you're going in the way they want to go. But most of those promises will not be kept.
No, well, first of all, as you know, party platforms are surprisingly indicative of what a party does in power, or at least tries to do in power. And they are much better. Now, sometimes parties keep things very vague for their own reasons in the platform, but they usually point in the direction the party is going to move in. And I think in the case of conservatives, it's the repeated nature of not getting what they want. I have a quote in the book from Bill Kristol. I said, why are conservatives so angry? And he said, well, if you look at 40 years, we've won a lot of elections, but for the average rank and file, social conservative, abortion is still legal, gay marriage is gaining ground, the budget is still out of balance, we haven't repealed a lot of liberal programs. And so I think there is, I don't think voters are naive in terms of their expectations. I agree with you on that. I'm kind of pro-voter myself, even when they disagree with me. But although I don't like them as much in those cases. But I think in the conservative case, the rank and file actually have reason to be frustrated that these promises can't be kept, which then I think we need to take the meta leap and say maybe there's something flawed about this kind of conservatism. But thank you for the question, and thank you for picking me up that day. Please. Please, sir.
So I'd like to return to the theme of Reagan Democrats. There was an interesting piece in, I think it was the Times a couple days ago, about what's happening in Wisconsin and how the labor movement there has been destroyed. And the fact that it has served as sort of a mediating civil society institution in the United States. Can you react to that in terms of this is a conservative initiative, really, to take the labor movement out throughout the country and what that means for the future?
Yeah, I think I don't trust it when we liberals say what kind of thing I'm about to say, because always we look at the other side and say they're smarter and tougher than we are. But I'll say it anyway, which is that I think on the whole, conservatives have been more attuned to using power to reduce the power of the other side. And nothing is clearer than in the case of the labor movement, where there's been a systematic attack either through the NLRB or in Wisconsin through very direct means. Interestingly, Kasich tried it, got rebuked by the voters in a referendum, and it actually changed his course a little bit. I think the contrast between Kasich and Scott Walker is fascinating. But I do think that, the decline of the labor movement is a real problem, because if you look at the voting patterns of identical working class whites, those who are in unions are more likely to vote for progressive candidates than those who aren't. Somebody once told me about a labor leader who was campaigning for Al Gore in Pennsylvania, a big NRA state, and he was trying to persuade his members to vote for Gore, and a lot of them were thinking of voting Republican on the gun issue, and his line was, at least under the Democrats, you can afford ammunition. And so I do think that's a problem. But it's worth remembering a lot of the Reagan Democrats were themselves union members. In other words, that it was a reaction. Some of it was a reaction on race. I don't think there's any doubt some of it was backlash. Some of it was frustration with the state of the economy under Jimmy Carter. So some of it was a certain kind of, and I don't use this in the same negative connotations I might use it with Trump, a certain kind of nationalism or patriotism. There were a lot of things going on with those voters. So some of them were unionized. But I do think that the attack on unions has a real purpose, a real political purpose, and they know exactly what they're doing. And it's a real problem for progressives. In some ways, I see the Bernie Sanders campaign as recreating some of the grassroots action that we lost with the decline of the labor movement, but I don't think it can substitute for the richness of labor's connection to people, and not passing card check or something like it, or something more a compromised version of it in the first 2 years of Obama, I think was a terrible mistake on the part of the Democrats. But that's for another day. Thank you, sir.
I'll add an anecdotal story to your introduction and also to an earlier answer you gave. Our daughter finished her residency program and is now a practicing physician. She told me recently she's investigating what she has to do to get licensed to practice in the UK so that she has a fallback position if Donald Trump is elected president.
Thank you. So British or Canadian? Okay, please.
You made one of the rare distinctions in this town between conservative with a capital C and conservative with a lowercase c. Your employer never makes that distinction. It calls right-wing judges conservatives. It calls people who make the most radical decisions or advocate the most radical positions conservatives. Does that bother you? You use the word a lot too. Can we come up with a better term than conservatives for those people?
Well, in fairness to my newspaper, I think most newspapers do exactly the same thing. And I do think it's important to think about this big C, small c distinction, because in many ways we liberals have a strong streak of conservative in us because we're actually trying to preserve gains we thought we made. And so in that sense, that is a progressive act, but it's also a conservative act on our part. I mean, in the 50s and 60s, that's why the term radical right got invented. And there was, one of the things I do in the book, by the way, is trace a lot of Tea Party thinking back to Birch Society, thinking there's a wonderful, somebody in the Tea Party was interviewed by somebody at the New York Times, and this person said, oh, they call us extreme, but they said that about the Birch Society too. And, you know, I think now, again, I worry about you throwing around the word radical too, because, you know, words like radical or fascist are abused a lot. And so I'm not crazy about throwing it around, but there are forms of what pass for conservatism that really are more a form of radicalism, or a much older word, reaction. And, you know, in thinking, you know, I've been talking a lot about this book lately, and I find myself more and more making a distinction between being a conservative and being a reactionary. But I can't imagine a reporter very successfully writing in a story, reactionary Senator so-and-so said yesterday. But it's a fair point. I don't know a good solution to it except to try to point out radicalism when you see it.
And the Post the other day used the term, and I've never seen it before, left-leaning to describe.
Well, left-leaning is probably better than left-wing, and it may be sort of being fairly cautious about that too. But it's all the labels are potentially vexed for all of us. That's why I had this tripartite description of myself as a liberal with social democratic leanings and a moderate disposition or temperament. Again, Mary may or may not agree with the last, but
thank you for clearing that up.
Sir, last one, and I'm sorry for anybody who couldn't talk.
Yeah, thank you for doing this. This is fascinating. It does seem your thesis is interesting, but it does seem like half the story. You know, it's certainly true that the Republicans
It was long enough as is, yeah. But not too long. Well, it's a perfect length to purchase, but
I mean,
go ahead.
It's certainly true that the Republicans for decades have used social issues and anti-government rhetoric as bait to get voters, to get what they want on the economics, which is what they really care about. But it's also true that, you know, Democrats have used economics in order to get what they want on the social issues, which is really what they care about. And you can see why that is if the Republicans represent the 1% or the 0.1%, the Democrats, who really only care about getting richer, the Democrats represent the 19.9%, the professionals below, who really care about the social issues, and they don't really want their taxes to go up either. So it seems as if there was a time. I mean, the idea that the poorly educated are now kind of a laugh line and certainly no longer part of the Democratic Party.
The reason I went on my way is I don't think they should be a laugh line. I only think Donald Trump saying that sentence should be a laugh line. I absolutely think that, in fact, I've said many times the bias of the press is the bias of the upper middle class. So the two things you don't want to be are an evangelical preacher or a union shop steward. So I'm believe me, my heart's with them, but I still found it astonishing that a presidential candidate would say what he said. That's all.
But I mean, what I'm suggesting is the Democratic Party now is, you wonder where all those liberal Republicans went, and they're now the core of the Democratic Party, and that's left this other 80%, these other people, basically with no representation from anybody. So I'm wondering whether your next book shouldn't be where did the left go wrong? I mean, how do you get those people back? It's not just a matter of beating the Republicans electorally. It's a matter of representing those people.
Well, thank you very much. And depending on the outcome of the election, I might have to try to write that book. No, you make a fair point. And in fact, one of the things, where are you? I just want to be able to see you when I'm answering you, if you don't mind. One of the things I go out of my way to say in the book is, for example, I think liberals are often insufficiently open and respectful toward people of faith, people with traditional values. I talk in the book about the issue on which I most wish we could have a thoroughly trans-ideological conversation is on the state of the family. Because anybody who's looked at Bob Putnam's great book, Our Kids, knows that if you care about inequality, you have to care about what working class families, white and black, can and can't do for their kids compared to richer families. And family breakup is a real problem. Now, as soon as you say that, I think it's also important for so I think liberals should not be afraid to acknowledge that, but conservatives should not be afraid to acknowledge that the economic change we're going through has really battered the family. And I don't usually agree with Peggy Noonan, but she had a very interesting distinction in her column yesterday between people in our society who are the protected and the unprotected. And the protected include well-off liberals as well as well-off conservatives. And I don't agree with everything where she took it, but I do think those of us who are liberals should be very conscious of that. On the other hand, when you say that the upper middle class liberals don't really want tax increases, their politicians actually vote for them. I mean, that, both Clinton and Obama signed substantial tax increases on their well-off constituents. And it's also true, as you might point out, that they tried to protect Democrats in Congress may have tried to protect the sort of 200 to 400,000 range, and they conceded that. But still, they were willing to do it. But I take your point, and I'm not someone, I wrote a whole book on religion and politics because I think if you are a progressive, you should be genuinely open-minded, and that includes being open-minded toward the very people you're talking about. And if I may, just to use your question to close, and I can actually invoke a religious theme. I have a good friend called Jim Kloppenberg, who is a professor at Harvard, who has just written a wonderful long history of the democratic idea called Towards Democracy, which is coming out, I think, in about 6 months. And at the end of his book, he has a wonderful passage. He quotes St. Paul. And St. Paul said that we must see through each other's eyes and think through each other's minds. And I wrote this in part because I'd like to see a time when we might actually be able to do that again in politics. I tried as best I could in the book to see through conservative eyes, even when that was really hard for me. But I'd like to see a time in our politics where there is a sufficient degree of moderation and respect. And Hillary Clinton the other night even used the word love, which was kind of fun to hear a politician use in the context of our current politics, where we could reason together again. And so I promise my conservative friends that if they make any adjustments in the directions I suggest, I will do my utmost to see through their eyes and think through their minds. Thank you all very much for coming.